Have you ever considered that patterns on windows could be dangerous, even deadly? I guess not. And I never suspected it until that ill-fated day. But let's start from the beginning. My name is Dennis. I'm an ordinary student at a typical university in the capital of Siberia. I enrolled about 5 years ago and am now in my final year. I live in a dorm because my parents aren't wealthy and there's no extra money in the family. So when I was offered a part-time job at a weather station near Novosibirsk, I didn't refuse. The pay wasn't huge, but the work wasn't demanding either. They explained everything to me on my first shift. I needed to sit at the station at night, monitor a wall of various relays and lights, and in case of unforeseen circumstances, record the incident in a logbook and report to senior personnel by phone. I quickly got used to my work duties and the bit of extra money which allowed me to go to the movies and cafes with my girlfriend, and sometimes even order a pizza to the dorm. The shifts were exclusively at night, so they wouldn't interfere with my studies. And so one late evening, I arrived at work. My colleague, Alex, was already getting ready to go home and warming up his car's engine. "Hey, Janice, you weren't in a hurry to get to work today?" "Huh, missed my bus," I replied, a little sheepishly. Alex was just over 30. He'd never been late when he had a day shift and took over from me in the morning. "We have a slight problem today. The electric heating is acting up. If you turn it above the 3rd setting, the breakers trip. It's -20 outside today with a strong wind. It's chilly to sit with the heating only halfway." "That sucks. What should I do? I'll freeze solid by morning." The repair crew was supposed to arrive an hour ago. They probably got held up at another site. But they'll definitely be here tonight, otherwise we'll have to build bonfires all night. Alex joked and wrapped a scarf around his neck. "Record their arrival and departure times in the logbook. I don't remember the number, something about repair work. You'll find it." "All right, I'm heading home. Have a good shift." With those words, he put on his hat and headed for the exit. I began to change and prepare for my shift. After the frosty street, it felt quite warm inside, but I knew the cold didn't drain body heat immediately. At first, it always seems fine indoors, but give it a couple of hours and your fingers will freeze, making work rather unpleasant. While I was wondering how I would stay warm all night if the repairman didn't show up, the door opened, and Alex's head, generously covered in snow, "They're here. Open the gates for them," he announced, and his head disappeared and the door closed. The station was some distance from the city, and to get here, I had to travel to the final bus stop and then walk for about 10 minutes along a road cut through a pine forest. The station itself was located in a sizable clearing, and the entire territory, covering about half a hectare, was enclosed by a 2-meter-high chain-link fence. There were only 2 entrances to the territory, one next to the main gates, and a rough secondary one on the side of the fence. Hastily throwing on my jacket, I rushed outside and headed for the gates. The weather had significantly worsened. The wind howled loudly through the wires, and snow flew parallel to the ground. In such cold, especially with the wind, all my warmth was instantly drained. I wanted to get back inside as quickly as possible. A repair crew's Neva, with orange stripes on its sides, stood at the gates. I pushed the stopper and opened them. The car drove onto the territory and into the makeshift parking area. 2 men got out of it. One was tall and thin, the other a head shorter and stocky. Alex turned off his car, walked over to the crew, shook each of their hands and said, "Since I'm still here, let me show you the scope of the work." I sighed with relief. I don't like interacting with people. For me, an obvious advantage of this job was that I had minimal need for face-to-face communication. Anthony and Walt, as the repairmen were called, took off their outer clothing and left it on the hanger by the building's entrance. Alex led them to the inner room, dedicated to all the station's equipment, and showed them the relevant panel. The tall repairman was Anthony, and he began inspecting the heating system. After fiddling inside, he tried to turn the heating to the third position, but the fuses immediately tripped, plunging the building into darkness. Right. You have several heating elements here. After the second setting, additional ones connect, and there's a breakdown in them. I'll go check. We should have spares with us, he said, and restored power to the station. Alex said goodbye to everyone, wished me a good shift again, and he and Anthony headed for the exit. Walt and I were left alone, and I offered him some tea. He accepted, and while I was filling the kettle, the door opened and Alex walked in with a puzzled look. Guess I'll be sleeping here tonight.
It turned out that while he was showing everything to the crew, the weather had significantly worsened. Visibility became almost zero, and his car was covered in a thick layer of snow. I looked at the thermometer readings and was slightly taken aback. The display showed minus 43 degrees Celsius, but when I arrived here, it was only about 20 degrees at most. A couple of minutes later, Anthony also came in, announcing that he had found the necessary part for the repair. Outside, the wind whistled and howled. I approached the window and saw almost nothing. The snow flew in an almost uniform white veil, with only occasional small clearings, and only through them could one guess that this entire murky white mass was moving. Moreover, frost patterns began to appear on the windows. They were forming right before my eyes on the window pane, taking on bizarre shapes. Did our thermometer glitch? It's showing minus 49 already, Alex said, tearing my gaze away from the patterns. Look at the windows, I replied. They're freezing over right before our eyes. I don't think the thermometer is lying. I turned back to the window and almost jumped in surprise. At first, I thought someone was looking in from outside the station, but it turned out that one of the patterns had formed the outlines of a creepy face. The mouth was wide open, and the face, in general, resembled a grimace of suffering. The blizzard out there is no joke. The gates are already buried in snowdrifts. Our Neva is one big snowdrift. We'll have to dig it out. I think that road through the forest is also snowed in. So, Walt, we're stuck here. Anthony's voice sounded. The repairmen started discussing something, and I had already tuned out their conversation and returned to that face on the glass. Come here, I called to Alex, waving him over. Look at this messed up thing. You're right, it is messed up, he said thoughtfully, examining the window. Could it really be a random pattern? It's eerie, by God. I walked to another window. There was something similar. Not the same face, but clearly a face. This was definitely not a coincidence. No one would be playing jokes in this weather on the outskirts of the city, and two faces woven accidentally from ice patterns were certainly not an accident. It's the same here, I cried. A wave of fear washed over me. The expressions on those faces were unsettling, and there was no good to be expected from them. Everyone turned at my shout. Anthony walked over to me, saw the face, and came up with nothing better than to press his finger against where the pattern's mouth was. As soon as his finger touched the glass, Anthony froze. A layer of ice appeared between his finger and the glass. Anthony didn't move. "What are you doing?" Walt called out to him, trying to pull his partner's hand from the glass. The hand wouldn't budge, as if his finger was firmly frozen into the glass. From his finger towards his shoulder, patterns like those on the window began to creep. His skin turned blue as the pattern advanced, and Anthony himself wasn't even breathing. I tried to pull him away from the window, but his body was so cold, even through his clothes, that I practically burned my hands with chill. "Anthony, snap out of it!" His partner raised his voice and tried to pull him from the window. Nothing worked. The pattern had already reached his shoulders and was stretching towards Anthony's face and legs.
We watched in stunned silence, observing the spread of this pattern. When it reached his mouth began to open itself, and his expression became similar to the icy faces on the windows. The windows themselves were covered with a thick layer of ice, but those terrifying faces were clearly visible. It seemed to me that empty, pupilless eyes were watching me from the window surfaces. You know that effect with some portraits? Wherever you go, the gaze is always on you.
Everyone stood in bewilderment. Something inexplicable was happening right before our eyes. The repairman was covered in a crust of ice with those eerie patterns. Alex looked at the information display and said, almost in a whisper, -66. Damn it! We're going to freeze to death here, if this thing doesn't get to us first, I replied, clearly panicking. We need to inform the city. With these words, Alex pulled out his phone, looked at the display, and started spinning around, raising the device above his head, clearly trying to catch a signal. No signal. Does anyone have service? Walt and I looked at our smartphone screens, without much hope. There was no service at all. The pattern from the windows had spread to the windowsill, onto the window frame slopes, and was now beginning to advance along the wall. I looked at Anthony. He was completely covered in ice, and now, inside this block of ice, a person was no longer even discernible. The pattern was crawling across the floor from him in all directions. At some point, I noticed that one of those faces was starting to form on the floor. The display showed that the outside temperature had dropped to 73 degrees. We were all silent for a while. Alex was the first to speak.
All right, let's think about what we can do. We're at the station, in the middle of a pine forest. The outside temperature is below 70 degrees, plus a blizzard. Going out is pure suicide. The cars won't start, and even if they did, we couldn't drive through such snowdrifts. There's no communication, we don't know what kind of natural phenomenon this is, or what area it's covered. And on top of all that, some kind of devilry is happening. These demons on the windows. We can't touch them if we don't want to end up like him. With these words, he gestured towards the icy statue, which had been a very much alive person 10 minutes ago. All we can do is wait it out here. Maybe this frost front will pass and we can get out. Oh, I should have gone straight home. You might not have made it. We don't even know if this is happening locally to us or if these patterns have already killed half the city. Don't say that again. Alex instantly flared up, obviously thinking about his family. We still have electricity. We could try to restore the boiler to full power and then we might be able to hold out. Walt, who had been silent until then, responded. After this, he cast a glance at his former colleague and sighed. The temperature continued to drop steadily. How low could it possibly go? There was no time to lose, and we all headed to the engineering room. It was the most favorable place in the station because it was enclosed by walls within the building's main structure. Moreover, there were no windows, and those were definitely worth avoiding right now. Walt unscrewed the bolts, and with some difficulty removed the boiler cover. Here, a burnt-out heating element. You can tell by the color. We'll quickly replace it and it should work, but we'll have to cut the power temporarily. Here's a flashlight, shine it for me. Walt said and flipped the breaker down. The building immediately plunged into darkness and silence. If before there had been the hum of instruments, lights, and the heating boiler, now there was complete silence in the station, and the wind howling outside was distinctly audible. Alex took the flashlight, and I decided to scout around, using my phone's light. I moved very carefully, shining the light at my feet. I didn't want to step into those patterns. The wall with the windows was completely frozen.
It was entirely covered in patterns, and the nightmarish faces could be vaguely made out here and there. The frozen repairman was still there, and the patterns from him had already reached almost the middle of the room. Outside the windows, a multicolored glow shimmered, resembling the northern lights. What was happening out there? I had no answers. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the outerwear hanging by the door. Unfortunately, the clothes were covered in patterns, and I didn't dare even approach them. Luckily for me, the staff sofa was against the wall farthest from the windows, and it had several blankets and pillows. I gathered everything into a heap and returned to the engineering room. Walt had just finished installing the new heating element and flipped the breaker. The lights and the familiar hum filled the building, and it even felt a bit lighter. We tried turning the boiler knob to the third position, and everything was successful. The fourth and fifth positions also worked. Deciding to hunker down in this little room, we closed the door and waited. The room became noticeably warmer. We spread out the blankets and settled on them. It was quite comfortable. The only inconvenience was the dim lighting inside. The patterns had already frozen the main room and were practically reaching us. There was nothing else to do but close the door and wait for morning, and with it, help, if there were any living people left in this world at all. We started talking, and I learned a bit more about Walt. He was 56 years old. He had worked his whole life at one electrical substation, first as an electrician, then as a duty officer, but in the last couple of years that job had become too stressful, and he had left to work on an on-call repair crew. From the perspective of peace of mind, it was much simpler. That's where he met Anthony. Walt spoke highly of him, saying they had become friends in the last year and deeply regretted that he was now gone, though it was unknown if we ourselves would make it out of here alive. As we talked and tried to encourage each other, I heard footsteps in the corridor. The wind was still howling, so it was unlikely that anyone had reached us. The sound of footsteps approached and stopped at our door. Silence hung in the air. We all strained our hearing until our ears rang. "Guys, are you in here?" a voice called from behind the door. It was Anthony's voice, but something was clearly off about it. On some vowel sounds, it was as if a sound filter was added, making them quieter than they should be. "Open up! It's very cold out here!" "Absolutely do not open it. That's not him," whispered Walt. We sat without making a sound while the entity behind the door tried to lure us out or make us open it. The doorknob began to twitch slightly. I sprang to the door and tried to hold it shut. In the next moment, my hand burned, and I found myself in a different place. Whew. It was a cave, shrouded in twilight and ice. The northern lights pierced through the ice, illuminating the cave. Sharp icicles protruded everywhere and in all directions. I looked around and saw something I wished I hadn't. Standing to my side was a creature about 3 meters tall, with the same face that appeared in the patterns. It held Anthony's body in one hand, gnawing off his limbs and body parts with a disgusting crunch. The repairman was frozen, and only his eyes could move. He looked at me. His gaze conveyed horror and a plea for death. Many frozen bodies were scattered around. More accurately, the remains of bodies. I felt sick, and nausea began to rise in my throat. I couldn't suppress a retch and made a sound. The monster turned its head towards me, tossed the body aside, and strode towards me. I started backing away, slipped, and fell, hitting my head painfully. When I opened my eyes, the monster was already reaching for me. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to push its hand away with mine, and then I was thrown back into our world. My hand was burning unbearably and aching almost up to my elbow. "Why the hell did you go over there?" Alex said.
Both he and Walt were holding me by the shoulders on the floor, their eyes wide and fixed on the door. The roar of the wind intensified for a few seconds, leaving an unpleasant ringing in our ears, and then subsided. Footsteps were heard again in the corridor, but this time moving away from us. The wind finally died down. We risked peeking out of the engineering room only half an hour later. No one was there. The walls, floor, ceiling, and furniture were covered in patterns, but they didn't bear that terrifying face. The temperature sensor showed -31 degrees, and the blizzard was practically over. I looked out the window. The cars were completely buried in snow. We watched in stunned silence, observing the spread of this pattern. When it reached his mouth began opening itself, and his expression became similar to the icy faces on the windows. The windows themselves were covered with a thick layer of ice, but those terrifying faces were clearly visible. It seemed that empty, pupil-less eyes were watching me from the window surfaces.
Signal appeared on our phones, and we were able to contact the duty officer. Soon, the road to the station was cleared, and we were able to drive to the city. Afterwards, there were inquiries with management and the police. I remember the boss calling me into his office and asking me to tell him what happened that night. After all, a person had gone missing. I tried to smooth things over and not talk about the supernatural devilry, but he sighed and said he had seen the security camera footage. He explained that the frozen body of the repairman had walked out the front door as the blizzard began to subside. He said that all this mysticism had occurred quite locally and nothing like it had been observed in the city. He also advised me to keep my mouth shut because certain organizations, not to be trifled with, were interested in the whole story. Later, employees of these organizations found me and made me sign a non-disclosure agreement. That night, I lost 2 fingers on my hand. They were so frostbitten that they had to be amputated, and there's still a mark from the frost pattern on the back of my hand. I quit my job at the station that same day, and I'm still afraid of patterns on glass to this day. I even bought a refrigerator without a freezer. I think that creature can drag people through these patterns, opening passages to its dimension to feed. I see that crunch and Anthony's eyes in my nightmares, and pray that creature doesn't find me. Because that monster got a taste of me.